For those who just joined us this afternoon, thank you for making it out here. And it was a bit informal this morning, and hopefully as we kind of get rolling in this afternoon, it'll become a bit more formal and more engaging to all of us here today. I actually really enjoyed the topic that we just finished, and just as Marianne said, it relates back to a lot of the things that we talk about in Christianity, which is around love. So again, welcome. If you're not from the church here, welcome to Sagan, the Church of Virgin Mary St. Athanasius. And we'll do a little introduction to Dr. Andy, and then we'll get our next part of the topic going. So go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, so just because we started a little bit more casually in the beginning, I want to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about who we are lucky to have with us. So Dr. Bannister is, he has a PhD in Islamic Studies, and that's why, we had so much jam-packed, amazing information earlier. And also he is an adjunct research fellow at the Melbourne School of Theology. He's the director of an organization called Solace. It's basically just an organization that equips Christians to speak about the gospel in a persuasive way. He was also previously working with the Ravi Zacharias International Ministry for many years as an apologist there. So we're so lucky to have you with us, and thank you for joining us.
So this session, it won't be a direct topic until a little bit later. So we'll do about I believe 20 minutes or 25 minutes worth of what we're doing is an interview between Glenn and Dr. Andy. Glenn is a close colleague, and he works here in Toronto or in Ontario with the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, the office in downtown. So they're going to go through kind of a personal interview and also other things. So welcome both of them to the stage, Dr. Andy and Glenn.
We're going to take things in a little bit of a different direction. Your minds are probably really full after this morning. And so I'm going to ask Andy a few questions. You can kind of get to know him on a personal basis, because he's more than just an apologist, whatever that is, and he's more than just a PhD, okay? So we're going to talk to him a little bit, get to know him a little bit. But I've got a question or two for those of you that were here this morning. Just love to hear from this morning's talk. Was there one or two highlights that you just took away that was something new for you, something that maybe you could use when you're sharing your faith with a colleague or a friend or something like that? Is there anything at all? Just love to hear one or two. Yes.
When someone asks how to approach a person, especially from Islam, that isn't accepting of the Bible, to even use it as to preach to them, he said, tell them, let's meet another time. You give me a passage of the Quran that's really special to you, and I'll give you a passage of the Bible that's really special to me. And to me, that continues, the Christ-like aspect that we should be living out. That, it's still a loving manner to approach each other.
That's great. I mean, there were a few conversations. Thank you so much for that. Over lunch, in terms of being intimidated, right? Or fearful because I don't know if I'm going to have all the answers. That's actually one of the questions I'm going to ask Andy about, and maybe he can help us out with that. Is there maybe one more? Thanks so much for that. Is there one more highlight from this morning? Anything else? Yeah.
So I didn't know in the Quran that they talk a lot about Jesus, and I think that he was bringing up the point, when you're having a conversation, you could bring up, Jesus is brought up a lot in the Quran. So I didn't know that, but it's a good conversation starter.
Those common threads, those common starting points, right? Well, thank you. I hopefully this afternoon there's a lot more, but let's get to know Andy a little bit, okay? Because he's a regular guy here. So Andy, I know that some say you have a striking resemblance to Danny DeVito. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, actually, Glenn, I think between us we have a striking resemblance to Danny DeVito, because I have the lack of height and you have the lack of, I'm thinking sort of up here. So maybe between us.
So there you go. Resemblance between Danny DeVito. Andy gets lots of jokes about being vertically challenged, but he's huge in mental and spiritual stature, so we love him for that. So I wanted to ask him a question, because we throw around this word apologist. Like, what in the world does that mean? You would be amazed at some of the responses from people when Andy or someone else introduced him as an apologist. So Andy, what in the world is an apologist?
That's a great question, Glenn. And actually, maybe part of the answer is an apologist is somebody who responds to every question by saying, "That's a good question." Thank you, one person in particular who appreciated that joke. Yeah, I mean, the word apologist, in one sense, one of the common misconceptions people have is that it means apologising. And I know when I moved here in 2010 to Canada to live for a while, telling friends in the UK that I was coming here to Canada to be an apologist, and at least one person said, so hang on, you've been hired to apologise for the Canadians? And I said, no, they can apologise for themselves. But no, it's got nothing to do with apologising, right? It comes from, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, in the New Testament, we're told, always be willing to give a reason for the hope that we have. And the Greek word in the New Testament, in the Greek, translated give a reason, is the Greek word apologia, from where we get the term apologetics and apologist. And it simply means to give a reason or a defence for what you believe. Now, in one sense, it's a perfectly good word. The problem, I think, Glenn, with the word apologetics and the apologist is, firstly, we don't use it in contemporary culture. So if someone says to me on an aeroplane, I'm sitting next to them, and they say, "What do you do for a living?" And I say, "I'm an apologist." People go, "What? What does that mean?" If I say I'm an evangelist, they tend to run for the emergency exits, actually. So, and then Christians, I think, we sometimes hear the word apologist, apologetics, and it sounds very technical, and we think, we can't do that. So at the organisation I lead in the UK, the Solar Centre for Public Christianity, they're the team, before I came actually, figured out that rather than use the word apologetics, the phrase that's really helpful is to think about instead persuasive evangelism as being what apologetics is all about. And it's helpful to ask yourself this question, which form of evangelism would you prefer to use with your friends, your neighbours, your colleagues? Would you prefer to use persuasive evangelism, or would you prefer to use unpersuasive evangelism? Most of us, I think, probably want to use persuasive evangelism. Well, that's just apologetics. But that's such a fancy word, I think it's sometimes really helpful just to describe it as persuasive evangelism. Evangelism that really engages people.
And thanks for that. Now, you spent some time in the tech industry, and you're obviously a big fan of Apple. You've shared that this morning.
Well, look, Glenn, in heaven they use apples, and in hell they use Windows. Which would you rather use?
Well, I know where I'm going, so I guess it's going to be Apple. So, intrigued to hear how you ever became an apologist. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, thank you for that. I actually have Muslims to thank for my being an evangelist and an apologist, because years ago I was working for a big London university, actually working in event management and doing a bit of tech and other kind of stuff as well. But on the side I was doing some youth work. I was doing volunteering in my local church and doing youth ministry, and hadn't really thought much about giving reasons why I believed what I believed. I mean, with large groups of young people, youth ministry is more about crowd control than anything else, let's be honest. And then one day, someone's laughing rather too loudly. Then one day, someone came to my church and did a seminar on Islam. And they talked about, in particular, the fact that every Sunday they were going up to one of the big parks in London, England, where I was living, called Speaker's Corner. And Speaker's Corner is part of one of our big parks in London, where on a Sunday afternoon, you can stand on a ladder or a box, or in my case, 3 boxes and a ladder, and talk about anything, religion, sport, politics, and you'll get a crowd. And he was talking about how he was using Speaker's Corner as a place to witness to Muslims, because there were many Muslims at Speaker's Corner. And he was a very persuasive speaker, so I got talking to him afterwards, and he said, "Well, why don't you come to Speaker's Corner to see what we do?" And so the following weekend, I went up to Speaker's Corner to be met by my new friend, carrying not just 1, but 2 ladders. And I said, "Why have you got 2 ladders?" He went, "Well, I'm going to stand on one and preach, and you're going to stand on the other and preach." I said, "I've never preached on the street before." He said, "Oh, it's easy." I said, "Okay." I said, "I've never talked to Muslims before." "Oh, they're easy as well." Both counts were wrong. I got on that ladder. There were 200 Muslims there that day. They tore me to pieces, put the pieces of my faith, as it were, in a paper bag, patted me on the head and sent me home. And I remember going home on the train thinking, well, I guess I need to become a Muslim, because they have everything and I have nothing. And the following day, I remember sort of worrying about this, going to the local Christian bookstore and sort of explaining my my plight, and they said, "Oh, you need apologetics." And that was the first time I'd ever heard the word. And I said, "What is it? It sounds like breakfast cereal." And they said, no, it's this giving a reason. And they sold me a book or two, and I read the books. I got answers to every question that the Muslims had raised on Sunday. I went back to Speaker's Corner 2 weeks later, and they had new questions, and looked stupid all over again. But for the next 3 months, we would do this little exercise. I would go to Speaker's Corner every week or two. I'd try and share my faith with Muslims. I'd get bombarded by questions. I'd go home and I'd read during the week. And what the Lord did over those 3 months was give me a love of public evangelism, a love of answering people's questions, a love of Muslims, actually. I have huge issues with Islam, but I love Muslims. They're wonderful, passionate people to share our faith with. And everything began there, Glenn. It all began in one seminar on a kind of rainy afternoon in sometime around about, April 1997, in a sort of forgotten part of South London. So be careful what seminars you go to on Saturdays, because who knows, maybe some of you here today will get the bug for going and sharing your faith with people.
Thanks, Andy. We were having some conversations at lunchtime in terms of being fearful or intimidated. So you had the experience at Speaker's Corner. From there you started reading some books, going to some Saturday afternoon seminars, and then you finished a PhD. Yeah. So surely now you are fully confident in whenever you get up to do a talk in a different environment, there's no fear or nervousness. Can you talk about that a little bit?
The simple answer is no. Every time I get up in front of audiences, whether they're friendly audiences or hostile audiences, like today, friendly audience, last night, friendly audience. But sometimes I have to speak to people like Baptists, for example. I mean, they're terrifying. And no, very seriously, every time I get up to speak, I'm not a naturally sort of stand at the front kind of person. My favourite sort of setting is perhaps 2 or 3 friends, in a restaurant, and no crowd's bigger than that. And so, last night, case in point, we had 600 people here in the auditorium. I remember sort of looking at the crowd thinking, oh my, why do I do this? Lord, couldn't you send somebody else? And I think that's a good thing, actually, Glenn, because I think the biggest danger for those in public ministry, whether it's myself or other members of the RTM team or, your church leaders and pastors and ministers and whatever here, is that you can begin thinking you know what you're doing. And that's the biggest problem. Once we think we know what we're doing and we don't rely on the Lord, then problems happen. It can also happen as an individual Christian. You decide that you've read enough of the Bible, you've read lots of books. Yes, I know how to share my faith with my friends at university. It's easy. And then you get a bit overconfident and it all goes badly wrong. So yeah, it is scary. But here's the interesting thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with it being scary if that forces you back to relying on God, right? I think fear is a good thing. So if the idea of evangelism, fills you with fear this afternoon, don't take that as an excuse to say, therefore, I'm not going to share my faith with somebody, or even I'm not called, whatever that means, to be an evangelist. I think all of us are called to be evangelists as I read the New Testament. Take it as a sense that I need to pray a little bit more and trust the Lord a little bit more. The more we're afraid, the more we have to trust Him.
Thanks for that. I think one thing that we should all be mindful of is, Andy was an apologist all his life. And the turning point was he went to Speaker's Corner and he got annihilated, essentially. But he went back, and he went back, and he went back. And so it's just the perseverance and the endurance of moving forward in faith and not giving up and trusting God's going to do something. You do the same thing with every one of us. So I think we should be encouraged by that.
Actually, quick story, if I may, Glenn, on that very point of perseverance. I mentioned, for those of you, I think most of you here were before the lunch break, I mentioned in an answer for the lunch break, a friend of mine and a colleague actually of mine and Glenn's, Abdu Murray, who's our North American director at RZEM. His story of how he's a Christian now, but 16, 17 years ago he was a Muslim. And his story of how he became a Christian is very interesting. He said it started when he was studying as a student at the University of Michigan. I think it was University of Michigan, or was it Michigan State? Anyway, whichever one of those it is. A big rivalry between the two, so that's a bit of a faux pas. Anyway, studying at university, and one day, he's studying away at home. There's a knock on the door. He opens the door to his student apartment, and it's 2 Christians doing door-to-door evangelism. And Abdu loved chewing up Christians and sort of spitting them out. And he thought, oh, fantastic, you guys deliver. Come on in. And he said these 2 guys, I think Dave and Barry or something, came on in. He said he was outrageously rude to them. He stamped all over their faith and humiliated them and kind of sent them packing and thought, ha, Islam wins again. He said 4 or 5 days later, there was another knock at the door. They were back. And he said, this kept coming. I was rude and belligerent, and they kept coming back for more. And he said, that courage in the face of my outrageous belligerence sort of began to wear me down. I began to think, there's something these guys have that's empowering them, even though rationally I'm winning everything. And hey, that was his journey to begin investigating whether Christianity was true. It was two terrified evangelists who probably, I imagine, had lots of caffeine in them before they dared knock on the door for the 6th time. So even if you think, why am I having these conversations? It's tough and it's hard and it's whatever. Who knows how the Lord can use you if you just keep knocking.
Thanks for that, Andy. Now, you've been in a lot of contexts. You've been at universities around the world. You've been in mosques. You've been in synagogues. You've been in outdoor environments. What is the toughest question that you've ever been asked, and how did you respond to it? Briefly, I know you're an apologist.
Well, the toughest question, Glenn, was that one just there, and I don't know what I'm going to say. Sorry. Yeah, it's a fascinating question, because you're right. For those of us who do kind of public stuff, we get a lot of questions. I guess there's two answers to this, actually, and I'll do the first one first. That's a tautology, isn't it? Of course I'll do the first one first. The first answer I give to this is actually, I want to say every question, by which I mean, and it ties into the previous thing, one of the dangers, whether you are doing ministry up the front, or whether you are just, really passionate about sharing your faith with your friends, is when you begin thinking, I know the answer to this question. I've had this question a lot of times before, I know the answer. And so someone comes to the microphone at events, and stands up and looks at me and goes, okay, how can you believe in God when there's, when modern science has disproved him? And the biggest danger for me is to go, hello, I know the answer to this one, and you rush straight in and give your pat answer, forgetting that there's an individual behind the question. And so Ravi Zacharias, who founded the ministry that Glenn and I are both involved with in different ways, is very big on saying we need to answer the questioner, not the question. So in one sense, I try and tell myself every question could be the one with a massive story behind it. You don't know why the person is asking that question. But then in terms of a question that just in the very nature it's constructed is hard to answer. I sometimes find some of the questions around suffering, and we're going to talk about suffering actually after this interview, because I think we can give a very good theological answer to the problem of suffering, and I'll show you, I think, how we can do that. But when someone comes to you and says, why did God allow my beloved sister to die in that road traffic accident? Or why did my friend commit suicide? That's not a philosophical question, that's a pastoral question. And they're not really, there's a logical, rational component to it, but there's an emotional component to it. And that requires great care and sensitivity. So questions that have that very personal element of tragedy in them, Glenn, I would say, are the hardest, because you want to really just give some pastoral input to somebody, and you can't always do that from a stage in front of lots of people.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to ask him one last question. I think this is more or less for all of us. Can you share some thoughts on how regular people like us can engage without being trained, like perhaps the way you are? Can you help us out with that a little bit?
Well, I could be a little bit cheeky here and say that's the third talk this afternoon. I'm actually going to share some practical tools on how we can do that. In a nutshell, though, without stealing the thunder from that talk, so I'll give you all the answers. That will be an excuse for all of you to disappear after the coffee break and not come back. I would say the first thing we want to be doing is actually begin cultivating friendships and connections and relationships with people who are not Christians. If all of your circle of people that you spend time with are Christians who believe like you, if you're never engaging with people who don't share your faith, then there's no one you can share the gospel with. So a good question is to be asking, do I, when I'm at university, when I'm in my neighbourhood or whatever, do I have people that I'm interacting with? And then following on from that, what am I doing to try and generate good conversations with them? I think the biggest evangelistic tool we've neglected as Christians is just learning to talk to people. Sometimes as Christians we've forgotten how to do that without sounding weird. We feel that we're having a conversation with our next door neighbour. Maybe we're out the front repairing our bicycle, and she's out the front washing her car, and we haven't got beyond hello when we're straight into, so have you discovered the Lord Jesus, and are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? And she's like, what the heck are hear you talking about. If we just learn to be normal people and find ways of having friendly, engaging conversations such that people enjoy talking to us, then it's much easier to weave conversations about faith in naturally. And in the third session this afternoon, I'm going to share some ways to do that. So I would say, make sure that we are befriending and getting to know people who don't think like us. If you're a university student here this afternoon, and you really want to kick that up a gear, I would say when you're on campus, don't just become members of the Christian societies on campus. If you are involved in those, they're great. Get involved in some non-Christian clubs and activities. And hey, if you want to reach Muslims, go along to the Muslim society. Trust me, it's great fun. You go and sit at the back of their meetings. They'll come to you and go, hello, what are you doing here? And you say, I'm a Christian, is it okay? Trust me, you'll be surrounded by the end of the evening and have lots of great conversations. So go where other people are, form friendships, and then listen to my third talk this afternoon.
Now, if that wasn't a plug, I don't know what is. I'd also add to that. I think of Colossians 4, and a couple of us were talking about this. Colossians 4 says this. It says, pray for an open door. We can't underestimate the power of prayer, because when we do pray for those open doors, believe me, they happen. And then it says, be prepared to step through it. But then it also says this very interesting point. The rest of your life, let it be like a seasoning. A seasoning. Seasoning is something that tastes good. So if the rest of our life does not taste good to Muslims, does not taste good to non-Christians, how are those open doors going to happen? So we have a calling as Christians to pray, and we have a calling to get equipped. And many of you know what Rabbi Zacharias Ministries is all about. Andy's here to help you in that journey of getting equipped. And there are a number of other opportunities for you to do that as well. There are many resources, whether it's books, whether it's YouTube videos, podcasts, so on and so forth. There's also an online academy where there's a number of electives. Some of them are short, some of them are long. So there's all kinds of opportunities, and there's many opportunities outside our ZIM as well. But get equipped. Pray for the open door, step through it, and let your life be seasoning. Thank you. Thanks, Andy, for spending time with us.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy, and thanks, Glenn. Again, Glenn is a colleague of Dr. Andy here in Toronto. And just those who don't know, Dr. Andy is actually from Scotland, not from England. Same thing, I guess, but no, I'm kidding. But it's something I found out new, so I just wanted to share with you. So he's Scottish, I guess. So in the meantime, we'll do a song or two, and then we'll get into our topic. Marianne will introduce the topic as well, and hopefully do a quick Q&A at the end of that topic, and then a break, and then we'll go to the next one. So thanks again, and please join us in singing, please. Thank you.
So we'll let you guys choose a song once or if you have a particular song that you want to hear, even if it's not on the list.
Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay, so it's all good. We're gonna sing this without music until the music comes, okay? All right, I'm sure we all know the song, so everybody just, let's get involved together and pray it. All right. Over all the earth you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky. But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you'd reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again, over every thought, over every word. May my life reflect the beauty of my Lord, 'cause you mean more to me than any earthly thing. So won't you reign in me again, Lord, reign in me. Your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again. Music is back.
We'll go back to the list. Let's do Writing Save. thanks so much, guys, for singing along. Right now, we are going to start our next talk, and it's going to be on the truth about pain and suffering. I think this is a very relevant topic for us, as there's no way that we are going to go through life without some sort of adversity. Even Christ himself says, in the Bible, it says, you will experience pain and suffering, but don't worry, I've overcome the world. And so we're going to learn today together how to view our pain and how to view our suffering in a way that maybe helps us come closer to our Creator, knowing that He too experienced suffering. So we're very excited to hear what Dr. Bannister has to say.
Okay, well, thank you for leading us in worship so beautifully, and kind of welcome back after the lunch break. Before I dive into this topic, which, as I was saying to Glenn during that interview, is what's one of the hardest questions around this area. A little housekeeping thing we're going to do while I talk. We're going to just pass around this clipboard. Glenn will get it going. If you put your email address on that clipboard, we will do two things at RZAM Canada. The first thing we'll do is we'll sell your email address to Google and make a fortune. We have to fund the ministry somehow. More seriously, actually, if you put your email address down on that clipboard, we will send you copies of the slides from today. And so that means that some of the quotes and things, particularly in the previous talk on the God of Islam and the God of the Bible compared, which had bits of quotations from Muslim scholars and all these kind of things, then that will all be there for you. So if you put your email address down, we'll also add you to the email list so that I'll keep you updated on things, but more particularly we'll give you the slides as a gift. One last quick request before we start. Could somebody give that, is there a chance that is that projector cutting the edge of the thing off? I don't know if it's pointing, no, because there should be an NG on the end of suffering. We're just losing the last inch of the thing. I don't know anyone who's technical, whether it's just pointing too far to the right, I don't know. It's in the ceiling, isn't it? So we are a bit stuck. Never mind, you know what, it'll work. Let's hope there's nothing on the right-hand side of the screen. Don't worry, it's fine. I thought it was there, and I realised it was up there. Although it would be amusing to see somebody kind of get a ladder and try and do that during a talk on suffering and evil. That might just be chancing things a little bit as they fall sideways and break a leg. Evil and suffering. Somebody once said, evil is kind of still a four-letter word. We may live in a world with all kinds of science and technology and progress and advancements and various things, but to see that for all of that we still live in a world with lots of problems, you just need to open the newspapers or turn on the television to see all kinds of issues all around us. If it's not violence and terrorism in some part of the world, if it's not the latest shooting in the USA, it's skyrocketing levels of teen suicide. If it's not violence and warfare in Syria, it's famine and disease somewhere else in the world, or even homelessness on our very own streets right here in Toronto. It seems to be everywhere. And if it's not in the news and on the media, of course, issues of evil and injustice and suffering confront us on a very personal level. I was doing a talk on this kind of issue at the University of Ottawa a couple of days ago, and I opened with the story of, it's about 20 years or so ago now, but I remember a close friend of our family named Anthony. He was a nurse at a local hospital near where we lived, and he was walking home from work one night after a late shift there at the hospital when four guys jumped him on a darkened street corner, beat him to a pulp, stole just $20 from his wallet, that was all he had, left him for dead, and in the process left him with life-changing injuries such that he could never work again. And he had a young wife and young children, and he's still living with the consequence of that example of injustice and violence 20 years on. And I remember back then thinking, what kind of world do we live in? That somebody can be walking home from a hospital shift, having poured their life into helping others, to have that happen to them. We live in a world where sometimes these things are sort of out there on the news, or sometimes they confront us by affecting our family or our friends. And whether it's evil and injustice, suffering and pain, the broken world that we live in raises all kinds of questions. Questions that actually as human beings, not just as Christians, as human beings, we can sometimes be tempted to try and avoid. In fact, as the poet T.S. Eliot once remarked, he said, humankind cannot bear very much reality. In other words, we often like to sort of pretend things are rosier than they are, rather than actually deal with the real issues. But when we take a long, hard look at the brokenness that we see around us, there are a number of questions, I think, that arise, quite frankly, for me. I mean, one of the questions that I think arises is the fact that why is it that no matter how much money or politics or education or technology that we throw at the world, the problems of humanity don't seem to go away? It doesn't seem that we can solve the problems of the world just using progress. Of course, progress raises the question of, are human beings getting any better? We love to sort of I think flatter ourselves with the idea that, here we are in the second decade of the 21st century and we are so much more sophisticated than people in the past. But I remember somebody once remarking, it's a sobering historical fact that actually the life expectancy, once you get out of childhood, hasn't increased more than about 10 years since Roman times. Especially if you factor abortion into the statistics, that we like to think that we are much better, but actually have things really advanced. So when you look back through history, arguably things are getting worse. The 20th century was the bloodiest century on record. Things have not got better; things have actually got worse in many ways. And then there's the question of how do we respond personally? How can we find hope? How can we avoid pessimism and despair? And especially when we personally experience injustice or violence or crime or suffering, how do we respond? Do we respond with anger? Do we respond with revenge or vengeance? Or do we respond with forgiveness? And if so, how do we do that? And then, of course, perhaps the most important question of all, and where we're going to focus a lot of our time this afternoon, is this whole question of where does God fit into all of this? Where is God in a broken world? Indeed, isn't the very fact that there is suffering and violence and injustice in the world, isn't that a massive piece of evidence that there is no God? My atheist friends would say that. They would say, look, it's proof there is no God, that there is suffering and violence and injustice. A few weeks ago, I recorded a dialogue with one of the most famous atheist philosophers in the world. He's the gentleman on the right with the glasses, with his sort of back to us slightly. That is a gentleman called Peter Singer. And Peter is based at Princeton University and is arguably one of the greatest atheist minds today, atheist ethicist. And Peter, very early on in our dialogue, took this track. He went, the reason I don't believe in God, Andy, is because there is suffering and evil and violence in the world. It was his number one go-to argument to try to respond to me. Well, our time is short this afternoon. We could easily spend hours exploring this topic. I really want to spend just 35 minutes. So I want to raise three thoughts for you this afternoon around which I'm going to centre my comments on this subject, and then we'll have some Q&A time together. Three thoughts I want to talk about as we explore all of those questions I've just raised with you. I want to talk for a few moments about the reality of evil. I want to talk for a few moments about the nature of evil, and I want to talk for a few moments about the universality of, I should say evil, not Evie. If your name is Evie here this afternoon, I'm not saying that you're universally evil. Universality of evil. Now let's say a few remarks about all of these. Let's start with the reality of evil. And it was interesting that the one thing we can't really do as human beings is try and deal with the problem of suffering and evil by saying it doesn't exist. It doesn't really work as an option. And you may think, well, why raise it then? Well, the answer is some belief systems try. So Buddhism takes this route. Buddhism has largely traditionally tried to say that suffering is an illusion. Maya is the name for that particular doctrine in Buddhism. It comes because we're attached to the world, and if we removed attachments, removed desires, if we didn't love our loved ones, we wouldn't feel suffering when they die, and so on and so forth. So suffering is really an illusion caused by being attached to things. It doesn't really work, though, I think, as an explanation. Atheism would say, a consistent atheism would say, well, everything in the world is just atoms and particles in motion. We talked about this last night in the talk on science. And this was actually what I put to Peter Singer when we talked a few weeks ago. When Peter raised the problem of evil, I immediately turned around to him and said, Peter, my question for you, sir, is how you call something evil. There are just configurations of atoms. and you may not like a particular configuration of atoms, but what on earth gives you the right to say that it's evil? That's a moral judgment. Where is that coming from? And I think on atheism, the best you can say is I don't like something, but to actually say that it's evil is problematic. Where is that coming from? And when you begin reflecting on the very nature that evil appears to actually be something real and substantive that we need to talk about, that can actually, even itself, can change things for you. The gentleman on the screen behind me is W.H. Auden. He was a famous English poet in the 20th century, and he has an interesting story. He grew up in a Christian home, but rejected it as a young man. He threw off as what he saw as the shackles of religion. He became a humanist and an atheist, and then eventually ended up moving to the United States. And in 1939, he found himself living in Manhattan, in New York City, in a German-speaking part of the city. And he went one afternoon to the cinema, and he was sitting there in the cinema watching the newsreel that was playing before the movie. In those days, that was how you got your news. You didn't turn on the television and get news. You would see these newsreels that played the news before the movie. And he was sitting there watching this newsreel, and the newsreel on the screen was showing footage of Hitler's tanks rolling into Poland at what would become the start of World War II. And he said he was shocked that the other people in the audience, some German people in the audience, were clapping and cheering as they saw Polish people getting shot and bayoneted. He said there were people jumping on their seats and shouting, "Kill them! Kill the Poles!" And so on, all this kind of language. And he said he ran out of the cinema, his head spinning, reeling with the horror of this. And he said, I realised two things instantly. First, he said, I realised instantly that evil really existed. I had just seen it on the screen, that there was such a thing as real evil. And then secondly, he said, I realised instantly that my atheism didn't explain it. He said, I knew that it wasn't enough to say that I didn't like what was going on over on the other side of the world. He said, there had to be an actual reason why Hitler and all that he stood for was wrong. And as he explored the implications of that, it led him back to the Christian faith that he had rejected as a young man. He would later say that only a God outside of the world can define good and evil in such a way that we can explain what we can see and actually enable us to name evil as evil. And of course, if we can't label it correctly, then we can't begin to deal with it. So that's just a few thoughts on the reality of evil. Now let's talk about the nature of evil for a few moments. What is evil? It's interesting to think about that question. What actually is evil? I mean, it clearly has to be more than just my personal preference, right? It surely isn't just the case that because I don't like something, that makes it evil. For example, there are many things that I don't like. There are many things that my preferences would cause me to reject. I don't like poutine, for example. I'm sorry to admit that to you. I lived for 6 years here in Canada. Quite frankly, sort of lukewarm fried potatoes with the equivalent of engine oil poured over them is not really a national dish. I'm sorry to break this to you. I don't like poutine, and incidentally, nor do I like country and western music. It's ridiculous. I can't bear it. It's just insanely bad. But just because I don't like country and western music, and just because I don't like poutine, that doesn't make them evil. That's just a personal preference. Evil also has to be more than just the preferences of society. We can't simply say evil is what society doesn't like. It's sobering to notice that every society in human history practiced slavery at some point. The Europeans practiced slavery on the Africans. The Africans practiced slavery on each other. The Muslims had a pretty healthy slave trade. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, every civilization that we know of in ancient history, and sadly more recent history, practiced slavery. And in fact, even today around the world, there are hundreds of thousands of modern slaves, particularly caught up in things like human trafficking. So it clearly can't be society's preferences. I don't think any of us want to say that slavery was okay when the Europeans were doing it because enough people were enslaving others. So preference isn't enough. So how do we decide what evil actually is? Well, Arthur Leff who was an atheist philosopher at Yale University in the 20th century. Very interesting thinker on this. He's an atheist, he's not no kind of Christian faith, but he wrote a very famous essay exploring this problem, in which he said, look, if there is no God, and he as an atheist believed there was no God, he said you only have two choices when it comes to defining good and evil. He said option one is you let every human being define good and evil for themselves. But he said the problem there is we've replaced one God with 8 billion little godlets all running around making up good and evil for themselves. And, then how do we decide when two godlets disagree with each other? I decide that it's okay to enslave people and Glenn thinks we should set them free. How do we decide the difference? Or, said Arthur, you go the other route and we let the state decide what good and evil looks like. But then you get might makes right. Was it okay for Hitler's Third Reich to do what they did because the state decided it was okay? But then Arthur goes further. He says, whichever route you go, whether you decide individuals get to make up good and evil for themselves, or whether you let the state decide what good and evil look like, you still have the problem that when anybody says to you, you should do this, or you shouldn't do that, you can look them in the eye, poke them on the nose, and say, yeah, says who? How dare you tell me what to do? I am not going to do it. Says who? And Arthur Leff says, all talk of good and evil, if there is no God, all talk of good and evil is shipwrecked on the reef of the grand says who problem. And he ends his essay on this with this little poem. He writes, nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. Those who stood up to and died resisting Hitler, Stalin, Armin, and Pol Pot, and General Custer too, have earned salvation. Those who acquiesced deserve to be damned. There is in the world such a thing as evil. But altogether now, says who? God help us. Interesting from a committed atheist writing those words. You see, the problem that Arthur is getting at is that the nature of evil and the nature of good implies an ought. If something is evil, it ought not to be allowed, it ought to be stopped, and if something is good, it ought to be encouraged. But where does that oughtness come from? I want to suggest that good and evil and ought only makes sense if we think about purpose, and we think about the purpose of something. Let me give you an illustration for a moment. If I imagine you came and talked to me in the coffee break this afternoon, and I said to you, I'm very cross today, actually, I'm in a bad mood, I may be smiling at the front, but actually I'm in a filthy mood this afternoon. And you say to me, well, Andy, why are you in a bad mood? And I say, well, the other week, I was at the local jewellery store in the town in Scotland where I live. I bought a new watch, and the jewellery store, they ripped me off, they cheated me, they sold me a bad watch. And you say, okay, why was it a bad watch? And you say, well, you won't believe it. You will not believe what happened. I took my new watch home, and I was putting up some shelves for my wife, and I was hammering in nails using my new watch like a hammer, and it broke. They've cheated me. What would you say? Well, some of you might say, Andy, would you like the number of a therapist here in this saga who can help you with your delusional tendencies? More likely, you might take me to one side and gently and pastorally say, Andy, that the purpose of a watch is to tell the time. And we determine whether a watch is a good watch or a bad watch by how well it does that, and not by whether it can beat in nails on a wall. And you'd be right. It's how once we know something's purpose, is how we know whether something is good or bad, or so forth. Well, if that's the case with watches, what about human beings? Unless we know the purpose of a human life, if we know why we are here, what a human life should look like, then only then can we talk about good and evil, which would seem to suggest that good language of good and evil only makes sense if God exists. Because if God doesn't, we have no purpose. We are just cosmic accidents here just because of chance plus time plus natural selection. So the very existence of evil and the nature of evil, funnily enough, don't take us away from God. They point us right into the heart of questions about him. Well, we thought a lot about the reality of evil. We've talked about the nature of evil. A few comments on the universality of evil. And I'm going to have a brief look at what the Bible has to say about some of this. You know, it's interesting that evil is everywhere. Evil is everywhere. It's all around us. If it isn't, war in Syria, it's mass shootings in the USA, it's terror attacks even here in Canada, it's knife crime in London, in my capital city back home, it's human trafficking across the Western world, it's homelessness on our streets, it's brutality in China, the list goes on. And as I say, things aren't getting any better. Despite modern technology, things haven't improved. It was interesting that back in the mid-1990s when the internet was invented, some of the people who invented the internet said, we can imagine in 20 years' time how the internet will have brought people together and there'd be universal peace and harmony. Here we are, 20 years on from the invention of the internet. That doesn't describe Twitter to me on a Monday morning, quite frankly. Technology's made things worse, not better. And this affects each one of us too, doesn't it? You know, it's interesting. If you think you're basically a good person, you are basically foolishly naive if you think that you're not affected by the problem of evil and this tendency to go wrong in various ways. In fact, as somebody once remarked, if you think you're not affected by evil and that you're just basically a nice, decent person and basically perfect, the best cure for that delusion? Get married. I've been married for 20 years and my wife reminds me on a daily basis of my flaws and my foibles. It's fantastic. I didn't know just what a broken mess up I was till I got married, and now I'm reminded. Now I have kids who help point it out to me as well, which is great. As human beings, we can be angelic and we can also be monstrous. And the person who identified this, I think, the most powerfully is this gentleman on the screen behind me. This is a guy called Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a Russian writer and a Russian political activist who was imprisoned for many years in the middle of the 20th century by the Soviets there in Russia for his political views. And when he was released from captivity and hard labour and the prison camps, he wrote a massive book called The Gulag Archipelago. It's a book so big you could beat elephants to death with it. Not that we would do that because that would be immoral, but it's a big book. And in that book he writes about his experiences. And what's interesting is you'd expect him to blame the Soviets. I mean, after all, they were the ones who cruelly imprisoned him and took away his liberty and tortured and all these other things. But he doesn't. In the middle of this book, he reflects on the nature of evil, and he writes what some people believe actually is the most quoted paragraph from any piece of 20th century literature, when he writes this. He says, "The line between good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but it passes right through the middle of every human heart and all human hearts." He's basically getting at the idea that all of us can be good, and all of us can be evil. All of us have fractured hearts, as it were, and it's not good enough to go, the problem with evil is those people over there. It's that lot. If everybody was like me, the world would be wonderful. He's saying that all of us have this issue to contend with. And it's profoundly uncomfortable, because many of us as human beings are, wedded to the idea that we're basically good. We like the idea, many of us deep down, if we divided the world into good people and bad people, we'd be standing over here with the good people. We sit there and we think, well, I haven't killed anybody. I haven't murdered anybody. I haven't started a land war in Europe. I haven't invaded Poland. I haven't, exploited the poor. I haven't served poutines and my friends, or, put on a country and western CD in the car. I haven't done any of those things. Well, of course, nice try, but no dice. Because each of us are, if we're honest with ourselves, pretty mixed bags, right? We can be kind as well as cruel. We can be as quick to hold a grudge as we can to forgive. We can be petty and spiteful one moment and generous the next. Compassionate one minute and the next moment happy to rejoice when somebody else fails, because we are all part of this mixed bag, the human race, and collective responsibility catches all of us up in the end, no matter how fast we try to outrun it, and all of us end up at various points in our lives standing on one side or the other of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's dividing line. Indeed, as the novelist and screenwriter Nick Hornby, not a Christian, again a secular writer, put it, he wrote this once. He said, "I'm a good person in most ways, but I'm beginning to think that being a good person in most ways doesn't count for anything very much if you're a bad person in one way." And of course, read the news and we might get very worked up about all the evil out here, and that's easy to do that. but we also need to think about the evil in here and what we do about it. And so that brings us to the Bible, and the whole question of what does the Bible and what do the scriptures have to say on this whole problem of evil and suffering? What does Christianity have to say? Where does God fit into the picture? Well, the first thing that intrigues me is that the Bible is very, very clear that the world is not the way that it should be. If you read the scriptures, it's pretty clear that evil and injustice and suffering are flagrantly, radically, totally counter to the will and purposes and character of God. According to the biblical story, God's creation was good. We read that refrain time and time again in the first chapters of Genesis. It was good, it was good, it was good. God created this beautiful world for us to enjoy and flourish. Evil is an alien intrusion spread like a cancer throughout creation, affecting both human beings and creation itself. And that's the first thing the Bible states very clearly, and even that, when you reflect on it, it's profound. Now, I always say to my atheist friends, isn't it interesting that when we hear of some terrible crime or atrocity, we read about the latest shooting in the USA or some terror attack in some part of the world, or we look at the pictures coming out of the Middle East, Syria and so forth, our first instinct is not to say, oh, well, I suppose, that's just life. Our first instinct is rather to cry out, that's not right, that's unjust, that shouldn't be allowed. And I always say to my skeptical friends, where does that urge to declare something wrong and say that shouldn't be the case come from? Well, according to the Bible, that comes because we know that that's not the way the world should be. Because we were made in God's image, we were designed for a different kind of world, and that instinct is natural and God-given. That's our God-given nature crying out, saying evil and suffering and sickness and death is not the way that it's supposed to be. We all know it. And the moment even our atheist friends protest against evil and suffering, they're admitting that actually they're closer to the biblical worldview than they might realise. So the Bible begins very, very realistically by naming evil as evil. And in fact, interesting, on the biblical worldview, it's to be expected. When you read the story of Genesis and what's gone wrong in God's good creation, it should not surprise us as Christians when we open up the newspaper or turn on the news to see, a world in turmoil. It's what we'd expect if the biblical story is true. So the Bible is very honest, and it names evil as evil, but it doesn't actually set out to explain evil, although I would say it gives us some hints. So I think one of the biggest hints the scriptures offer is this key biblical idea that love is the supreme ethic that God has built into creation. God designed this world and created us in such a way that he wanted us to be free to love him and love one another. But of course, love requires freedom. You can't coerce somebody to love you. During the interview that we had earlier, if you went home from this event today and told your friends that it was amazing, there was this interview in the middle of the event, and Glenn Robson fell on his knees in front of Andy Bannister and declared undying love for me. If you neglected to tell your friends that at the moment that Glenn declared undying love for me, I was pointing a shotgun at his shiny little head, you would have missed something profound. Because love requires freedom. You can't coerce. And the Bible strongly returns this theme that God has given us freedom to some degree because he wanted us to be free to love him, free to love others. But of course, if that's the case, there is also the possibility we might abuse that freedom to hurt others. There's a lot to be said for that approach, and over the centuries, lots of Christian thinkers and theologians have explored that. But, ultimately, the Bible isn't interested in just philosophical answers to the problem of evil. And I find that encouraging, if I'm honest, because neither am I. When I'm faced with evil or suffering and injustice, I'm sure the same goes for each of you. I don't sit there thinking, what we really want is a clever argument. We want a clever philosopher to write a paper on the war in Syria. That's what we need. Or my friend Anthony was attacked on the streets of London. I didn't sit there thinking, I just hope some Oxford philosopher gives a clever lecture where he opines on the nature of evil. My reaction is I wanted something done. I see some of those pictures on the telly. My friend was hurt. I want something done about evil and suffering. We need action, not just words. And the interesting thing is, that's exactly what the Bible does. When it talks about evil and suffering and injustice, it doesn't give us some kind of detached theological theory. It tells us what God has done about the problem of evil. And when it tells that story, it sets out to tell the story of the one place in history where all of these themes converge. It's the story of how God sent his son, Jesus, and how the powers of evil did their very worst to Jesus as he hung on a cross on a Judean hillside. And because of his great love for us, Jesus chose to submit to the very worst that the powers of evil could do to him. And evil and suffering, in the case of Jesus, led to death. And in the death of Jesus, God condemned evil and passed judgment on it. One theologian described Jesus' death on the cross as God's great no to evil. But Jesus then, of course, didn't stay dead. He rose from the dead because, not some mere random miracle, Jesus rose from the dead because in his death and in his atoning work on the cross, the power of evil was broken. God had broken the pain, the sting of sin and death, and death had no more grip on him. And Jesus' resurrection is that demonstration that evil had been defeated, the death blow struck to it, and sin forgiven, and forgiveness and freedom made possible. You know, the New Testament doesn't offer us philosophy. Instead, it tells us a story unique among the. There we go. Microphone's not my thing. Here we go. The New Testament tells a story unique among the world's religions and ideologies of how the Creator God steps into history, steps into space and time, and takes the weight of sin and evil on himself, and has bore that weight on his own shoulders. God gets his feet dirty with the dust of the world, his nails bloody with his hands bloody with the nails of the world. That, in short, is what God has done about the problem of evil. You see, evil requires more than words. Evil requires action. It requires something done. And in particular, evil and injustice. And I want to share a couple of final thoughts and then we'll kind of wrap this up. Evil and injustice require two things, I think. They require justice and judgment. And they require something said about forgiveness. We're back to the theme of justice and mercy that we talked about before lunch. In terms of judgment, it's interesting that the Croatian theologian, Miroslav Volf, we talked about him a little bit last night, so I'm going over some ground for those of you who were there. He's an interesting gentleman. His people experienced terrible injustice during the Balkan Wars in Eastern Europe. His people in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe suffered genocide and warfare and all kinds of things. And as Miroslav began reflecting on that, he realized that raised some interesting questions about God and what God's actions need to be in the face of evil and injustice. Let me read you what he says. He says, I used to think that wrath and judgment was unworthy of God. Isn't God love? Shouldn't divine love be beyond wrath? God is love, and God loves every person and every creature. That's exactly why God is wrathful against some of them. My last resistance to the idea of God's wrath was a casualty of the war in the former Yugoslavia, the region of the world from which I come. According to some estimates, 200,000 people were killed and over 3 million displaced. My villages and cities were destroyed, my people shelled day in and day out, some of them brutalized beyond imagination, and I could not imagine God not being angry. Or think of Rwanda, in the last decade of the past century, where 800,000 people were hacked to death in 100 days. How did God react to the carnage? Did he dote on the perpetrators in a grandfatherly fashion? Did he refuse to condemn the bloodbath, but instead affirm the perpetrators' basic human goodness? Wasn't God fiercely angry with them? Though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath and God's judgment, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who was not wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God is not wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love. And one of the things we have to hold on to as Christians is this idea that actually evil is not the last word. We do believe in a God who will judge, who will ensure that wrongs are dealt with, that evils are put right, which gives us hope, actually. I often say this to my atheist friends, that were I an atheist, I would struggle with the fact that is a hopeless existence. If you don't get justice in this life, there is no hope. But Christianity and the message of the nature of who God is, his great love for the world, that means he will act as judge and as the one who puts right what is wrong, means that even if it's hard for you to see humanly how justice will be done, we know and we trust that it will be. But the final thought that I have for you this afternoon is evil and injustice also raise the question of how you respond. What happens when evil and injustice strike you in your own life? One way, of course, you can respond is you can take vengeance. So, for example, myself and my friends could have decided to go out and hunt down the people who did that to my friend Anthony. We could have perhaps worked out who they were, and we could have jumped them on a street corner armed with baseball bats and gone, okay, you want to know what happens? Right, now you're playing with the big boys. We could have done that. We could have decided the way to deal with what happened to our friend was to do exactly what they'd done to him to them. That might have been one approach. Of course, the problem with that is then the spiral of violence goes round and round, because then revenge is taken for the revenge, and revenge is taken for the revenge and for the revenge. And we can think of many parts of the world where that spiral of violence goes round and round and round, because people have not found a way to respond differently. What does a different kind of response look like? Well, during the 1970s and 1980s, there was a lot of terrorist activity in the United Kingdom, particularly part of the United Kingdom, the UK, and Northern Ireland. If you look at a map of the UK, that's the sort of island to the west of the UK, and up in the north corner of that, there was a lot of sectarianism, dating back for centuries actually, with Protestants and Catholics, or at least people using those labels, attacking each other viciously over land claims that went back for hundreds of years. And on the 8th of November, 1987, a bomb planted by a paramilitary group exploded in a town called Inniskillen in Northern Ireland during the Remembrance Day parade there. And many, many civilians were hurt and injured. And one man in particular, called Gordon Wilson, was injured in that explosion. And also his daughter, Marie, a nurse, was fatally wounded. And Gordon Wilson, there he is, and at the bottom right, and there's his daughter. They were buried in rubble when that 40-pound bomb went off and exploded that Remembrance Day parade. And unable to move, he lay beneath the rubble and held his daughter's hand as she lay dying. And 5 minutes later, rescuers pulled him and his daughter out, and she never regained consciousness and died later in hospital. Shortly after that, Gordon was interviewed by the BBC, our equivalent to the CBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. And during that interview with the media, he described with anguish his last conversation with his daughter and his feelings towards those who had murdered her. He said, "She held my hand tightly and she gripped as hard as she could. She said, 'Daddy, I love you very much.'" Those were her last words to me, the last words I ever heard her say. But then, to the astonishment of listeners in the interview, he went on to say, "But I bear no ill will. I bear no grudge. Dirty sort of talk is not going to bring her back. She was a great wee lassie." We'd say that in Scotland too. She was a great wee lassie. She loved her profession. She was a pet. She's dead, but she's in heaven, and we shall meet again. I will pray for these men tonight and every night. And as the historian Jonathan Barden, who's wrote extensively on the troubles and the terrorist activity in Ireland, remarked, he said, "No words in more than 25 years of extremist violence in that part of the country had such a powerful emotional impact." And arguably his words began to change a culture and a generation. He publicly forgave those who planted the bomb. He said he would pray for them, and he also begged that nobody else take revenge for his daughter's death. How do you find the power to forgive like that? Well, of course, the answer is that Gordon had a profound faith in Jesus Christ, and he believed that he had been forgiven much, and therefore he had to forgive much. And it all comes back to the cross, where not merely is our sin and wrongdoing forgiven, but also not merely is the evil out there dealt with, but also the evil in here is dealt with. And if the cross and the resurrection of Jesus is true, not merely does that deal with the problem at the heart of evil and injustice and suffering, it also gives us the power to then respond differently when we experience it in the world around us. And one of the most famous evangelists in recent years is the gentleman on the right of the screen. That is a very young-looking Billy Graham, very, very young-looking Billy Graham. And in one of his many books, Billy tells the story of an interesting encounter he had with a gentleman on the left. I'm tempted to sort of play sort of trivia and say anybody who can tell me who that is wins a prize. That is a gentleman called Konrad Adenauer. And Konrad Adenauer on the left was an interesting gentleman. He was, when they met, he was the Chancellor of Germany. And he had previously been the mayor of Cologne in Germany, and he was imprisoned by Hitler during World War II because he was against the Nazis. Well, after the war, Adenauer was released, and he went on to become the German Chancellor. And it was his job to help pick up the pieces of his shattered society and rebuild it. Imagine that responsibility, trying to put Germany back together with everyone in the world knowing what your country has done, and you are now trying to repair the damage and rebuild that shattered society. When he and Billy Graham met, one of the first questions that Konrad Adenauer asked Billy Graham was, he said, Dr. Graham, he said, do you truly believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead? Of course, Billy was a bit surprised because he's an evangelist. You'd sort of expect people would know. But he thanked him for the question and said, well, yes, of course I do. And to that confident answer, Konrad Adenauer replied with these words. He said, outside of the resurrection of Jesus, I do not know of any other hope for our world. And I think what a brilliant answer. When I look at our broken world and the mess out there, we can be tempted. We can be tempted to be despair. We can be tempted to give up. We can be tempted to blame others. We can be tempted to get angry or to take vengeance. Or sometimes to my atheist friends, I say we can be tempted to dream utopian dreams. Oh, if we just had more money and more education and more politics, and if we just change the president of the USA and all kinds of things, the world would be wonderful. There'll be rainbows and unicorns and everything. But it never works, and those dreams always end in smoke and ashes. The story of what God has done in Jesus shatters all of those temptations. It tells us we don't need to be hope. We don't need to be depressed. We don't need to be anxious. We don't need to take vengeance. We don't need to be afraid. And nor do we have to try and construct utopian dreams and feel depressed and frustrated when they don't arrive, because God has given us the answer in what he's done in the person of Jesus. Evil is still a four-letter word. I said that at the start. Evil is still a four-letter word, but so is love. And love is God's last word. Thank you for listening so patiently. But I think we're due to have a little Q&A now. Is that the plan? Yes, okay. So I don't know, where's the schedule? How long have we got to do that? It's a good question. Okay, let's have a wee look. Yeah, we're due to have a break at 3:15, so actually that gives us 17 minutes to do some questions with Arnie, and then we can stay on time. Which is a miracle, actually, when I talk. We never do things on time, but here we are. There's always a first. So we've got 15-20 minutes, so you know the routine.
Thanks for your talk. It was really nice. So, with the resurrection of Jesus, a lot of people don't actually experience the resurrection of Jesus in their life. Even sometimes Christians who are even in a monastery, or they have a really, they're really into church, or they're really seeking God, but sometimes they don't actually feel God comforting them in times of pain and trial. And so it's we're okay with the fact there's evil, and we know Jesus came, but why does God make it so hard? And if people who are Christians and who are really seeking God, trying to find God, and he's sometimes really hard to find. Imagine people who don't even have that faith. Why is God making it even harder? We can all accept, okay, there's pain in the world because of the fall, but why does God hide himself in a way, or make it so tedious, with all the distractions in the world, to finally connect with him and get a real answer? I feel I don't know. we can't sometimes, like the resurrection of Jesus, like we don't want just to know he died like 2,000 years ago. Like we want to see that resurrection in our life, and like sometimes like we don't sense that when he's so quiet.
That's a really good question. What's your name? Okay. Well, I think there's a lot of things in that question, Sandy. But let's start a little bit with the hiddenness of God. I mean, I think that's something all of us struggle with at times. You know, whether we're new Christians or old Christians, or just sort of seeking. Sometimes it feels that God isn't there. And I'm actually going to, I haven't got PowerPoint, so I'm going to do a physical analogy. I think one of the issues is that we sometimes think this is what's going on. We sometimes imagine that, look, we are, oh, these chairs are heavy. So right, you know, here's mankind and here's God, and we'd love to have this face-to-face conversation. And we sometimes think, of course, that, you know, God has done this, and we're sitting here going, you know, where are you? Where are you? But what if, in fact, it's the other way around? What if it's us who have done this? And you see, the story of the Bible that I see, and I've experienced in my own life, is God's approach to us is far more like God pursues us. And it's us who keep consistently going, no thank you, no thank you, no thank you, and so on. So the first question I would say, jumping back down to your level, is if God feels distant, who's moved? Is it God who's moved? Is it? Or is it us who've moved? That doesn't cover every category, but I think sometimes what I've found is helpful in my life, when God feels distant, is to ask the question, okay, what's going on here? Is there something in my life? Am I really seeking God? Is the question that I really want an answer to one that I really want an answer to, or do I actually know what God's answer is here, and am I running away from it? You know, one of the times I think we experience this the most in our lives, my wife and I, as I remember, you know, in the early 2010, 2011, when we were first trying to start a family, and my wife and I went through definitely two, possibly three, maybe four miscarriages on the way to first having children. And I can remember after the second or third of these, you know, failed pregnancies, I mean, you know, you can imagine asking all the why questions, and sitting there and you know, I was trying to comfort my wife and trying to say with clever philosophy and theology, because I sort of fancied myself somewhat as a theologian. And I think one of the lessons that I felt the Lord lay on my heart at that point, and God did feel distant for a while, was that very sense of I was trying to do that on my own. I was trying to, you know, sort of reason my way to where I can sort this out. And actually one of the lessons that I learned through that experience was that profound sense of going, actually I can't. There are some things that I can't. It's about how clever you are, how many PhDs you've got, or how good your British accent is. I felt God saying, actually on this one, mate, you're sort of a bit, you know, it's either God or nothing. And I got to that stage where really appreciating it was God or nothing. And that was the kind of revelatory moment for me. And although I didn't feel it in the sense of the warm fuzzies, there was this incredible sense of going, well, either there's nothing beneath me at this point, or there is, even though, you know, we can't see it through the tears. And actually coming out the other side, going, no, there is something there. It just wasn't an easy journey, but I think there was a lesson that the Lord was teaching us through that. And I'm not saying it was God going, right, I'm going to jolly well kill some babies just to teach the Bannisters a thing or two. But I also think the Bible does say God turns everything, even the darkest of situations, for good. And that was very much our testimony. So the first question I would say, if God feels distant, who's moved? And have we stopped and looked around hard at the lesson the Lord might be teaching us? And then I think the second thing I would say, particularly for people who don't have any kind of faith, who are struggling, you know, I think it is interesting, isn't it, that so often it's in moments of profound struggle that people do find Christ. It tends to be easier to find God, I think, in moments of struggle than it does when life is going much more easily. Because I think, as you put it, you know, the world surrounds us with all of these distractions. That's not a new thing. That's always been the case, that life can distract you with things. And I think there is that question of going, you know, are we really willing to seek and push through that? And sometimes I think when suffering comes along, as C.S. Lewis once said, you know, pain is almost like God's megaphone to wake us up in the world. And I have many, many friends who actually, it was when things went wrong in their life that they first realised that they needed God, and it wasn't until that happened. And so I think that says maybe more about us as human beings than it does about God. But certainly I would say in terms of God being distant, one of the things overall that I think I've also learned through that journey is this is also why the Lord gives us each other. If it's just you and Jesus feels a bit distant, I don't think he is, but if he feels that way, then life can be tough. But if you have good Christian friends around you, people who you can pray with, who can carry you up, who can, like Moses on Mount Nebo, can hold your hold on the mountainside, hold your arms up when you haven't got the strength to do it, then I think it gives you that ability to push through. Because that is one of the tougher kind of questions. But I think my personal experience has been whenever I felt that the Lord has moved, it's me who's done it, even though if I haven't realised it at the time. Does some of that help a little? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that very, very honest question. Okay, so we'll go this way, and then there's a lady over here. What's your name, sir?
Mina.
Mina?
Yes.
Okay. Fire away, Mina.
Sorry?
I said fire away. Over to you.
Thank you. Very good talk. Thank you very much. It made it very simple. But one of the questions that I got in a conversation before was, after the definitions of evil, after we're going over all of this, and it's the choice of humans and all of that,
yep.
Then where is the power of God? And sometimes it's not only asked by Christians or non-Christians. Sometimes the answer comes from non-Christian. This is my God. Look what he did. And yours is not true, because if he was the true God, then he would have stopped it and he would have reacted and stuff like that. And sometimes it would be faced from the Christians as well, that the kind of questions from Sandy, for example, like, where is God when all of this is happening? So it comes like a two-way different questions.
Yes.
But the main concept is, where is God while this evil is kind of controlling the world and all of that stuff happening around us?
Yeah, lots of interesting stuff in there, Mina. I think the first thing I would say here is one of the things that I've long been intrigued by. This isn't to duck the question, but more to sort of raise a related one, is why it is that the problem of evil and suffering has particularly become a problem in the West. It's not exclusive, but it is interesting that it's more, if you look through the history of where this question has been asked. I first noticed this when I would travel to Muslim majority countries where Christians have been persecuted and experienced all kinds of stuff. I never heard this question. I never heard people say this to me. I had people ask questions of how do we remain faithful in the light of suffering? And interestingly, that's the question the book of Job is concerned with in the Old Testament. Not so much why suffering, but how can we remain faithful despite suffering? And so I think it's interesting to ask where that question has been generated. And I think one thing that generates it in some contexts is we get into our heads that life should be a certain way. That's especially easy here in the West, right? I mean, here we are, living in Canada, we're part of the 1%. I mean, life is amazing, and Tim Hortons on every corner, or Starbucks on every corner, depending on your preference and your bank balance. $10, etc. And we kind of expect life to go well. We don't think that there should be suffering. And I think that's one of the issues straight away. I think we need to revisit our expectations, because I think the Bible is very honest and said that because we live in a fallen world, yes, God has struck the death blow to evil. There's no question about how it's going to end up. It's not a, will it be God, will it be Satan? So the message of the cross is no, the death blow has been struck to evil, but there are still some aftershocks flowing around. There's somebody once said a good analogy in some ways. Analogies only go so far. Is I mentioned the World War II a couple of times this afternoon. After the Normandy landings in 1945, when the Allies landed on the beaches of France and broke the German power at that point, that historians will tell you was the end of World War II at that point, because the German power was defeated. The death blow had been struck, but the war rumbles on for another 18 months. There's a mopping up operation, and in one sense, that's where we are now. God's kingdom has broken into history dramatically in Jesus, says the New Testament, but the powers of evil are still, flapping around and causing as much chaos as they possibly can. But God is in control, and there will come that time where that finally is wrapped up once and for all. And what I find interesting, actually, Mina, is to go, this is not a new question. You look at the first Christians. They went around preaching the power of the resurrection, even while the Roman Empire was rounding up Christians, and Nero was setting lights at people on top of poles, and Christians being thrown to the lions and torn into and cut to pieces. And the first Christians going around, isn't it amazing? It's amazing, Jesus has died, and sin's power is broken, evil's days are numbered. And the first Christians, they weren't naive. They knew well that evil was still real, and we lived in a world where God's kingdom had broken in, and there was still more to be done before Christ returns, but they still faithfully look back to the cross and say, because of what God has done then, I can have hope for the future.
But how do you answer to people though?
Right.
So
to people.
I get into those conversations sometimes.
Right.
And how do you
Gotcha.
deliver an answer that would still reveal that Christianity is true?
Right. Okay, good. Brilliant. Good question. When you say people, are we talking atheist friends, or are we talking Muslim friends, or
Muslims,
particularly Muslims? Right. Okay. Excellent. I just want to check who I'm addressing here. Okay. Yes, I've got into those kind of questions with Muslim friends. And actually, I love those conversations, Mina, because I would say, okay, you know what? The interesting thing is we can actually put Islam and Christianity to the test here. Because Christianity does not offer any kind of political model for transforming a country. It's a heart transformation plan. So all we need to demonstrate the truth of the gospel is, can we find just one person whose life was an utter disaster area, and then when they became a Christian, they were transformed and turned around by the power of the Spirit. Just one. And we've proved that the gospel works because of that transformed life, because in a sense, it does what it says on the tin. And the answer is, history is replete with millions of them. I mean, if we had time, we could recount numerous stories. I mean, one that I often use with secular audiences is Glenn and I have a mutual friend, Tom Tarrants. And Tom now lives in the USA, Washington, and he's a Christian leader and incredibly gracious man. And you wouldn't know looking at Tom, but he was once on the FBI's most wanted list. He was heavily involved with the Ku Klux Klan and with incredible racial violence. And in fact, so violent was he as a young man that the FBI decided they were going to kill him. They basically laid an ambush. They knew where he and his partner, Tom and his partner, were going to go and do some horrible atrocity. And the FBI laid in wait. And the plan was they would kill him in the gun battle, because it's much cheaper than trying to deal with the criminal justice thing and trial and everything. And lo and behold, Tom and his buddy turned up to do their stuff. There was a gun battle, and Tom's partner got killed. Tom was wounded, but didn't die. He should have. And the result was he was sent to jail for a very long time. And while he was in prison, he had a dramatic conversion experience and became a follower of Jesus and was transformed from being an absolutely violent criminal thug to being one of the most gentle people you have ever met, and just an incredible witness to Christ. And I would say, my Muslim friends, right there, and if we had time I'd recite more of them. Now, Islam. Islam claims to have the ideal model for running a society. It claims to have, Sharia law, which tells us how to run societies and how to structure them and all these other things. So I say to my Muslim friends, show me one. Show me one Muslim society anywhere in the world today, or I'll be generous, anywhere in history actually, where actually that society has looked like heaven on earth because Islam has been applied as Muhammad said it should have done, and everything will be wonderful. Not even Medina in the time of Muhammad meets that criteria, because there was still crime and violence and injustice. And actually, if you look around the world today, Muslim societies are not worse, but they're no better than anywhere else. Take Pakistan, take Saudi Arabia, and look at crime rates, rates of viewing pornography, rates of sexual violence, all these things, they are exactly the same. There is nowhere where we can see Islam having an impact at the level that it should do if Islam is true. Christianity, on the other hand, there are millions of examples. And when you share that with your Muslim friend, if appropriate, I would use that to share your testimony and tell them what Christ has done for you. And I think we can put Christianity and Islam to the test that way. That's how I would have that conversation.
And would the answer defer to atheism?
Oh, and engaging with atheists. Well, you can actually run a version of this on atheists, or at least have a bit of fun with it. There was a very famous Victorian preacher in London back in the 1800s who was challenged to a debate by a leading atheist thinker. And his response to the invitation to debate was, "I would love to debate you. In fact, I'm delighted to. Yes, I accept your invitation with just one condition. I will bring with me to the debate 100 people whose lives have been transformed by Christianity. I'm thinking former prostitutes, former murderers, former drug addicts. I have many in my church whose lives have been turned around. Would you possibly just bring with you to the debate 100 people whose lives have been transformed by your atheist, free-thinking philosophy? Because then we can compare like with like." No debate ever happened. And what I would say to my atheist friends, I would say, look, the transformed lives of Christians doesn't prove that Christianity is true. Let's be careful here. For very atheists it doesn't. But it proves that something is going on. And I would say to my atheist friends, if I were in your shoes and I saw all these genuinely transformed lives, if I took them seriously, if I were you and I was a true free thinker, which is the term that atheists love to use, I would take a very long, hard look at Jesus of Nazareth. Because if his claims are true, there is hope, there is ultimate justice, and there is the promise of transformation for our hearts and our lives. If Jesus isn't true, then you've got nothing to lose. But if he is, he's got everything to gain. Why not take a look and see? Why not have a Bible study with me? I'll take you for coffee and we'll have a look at the scriptures together. See what happens. Okay. Yes, sorry, I forgot there's a hand over here, so we'll do, very good. We'll do this lady over here, and then we'll have a coffee break. What's your name, ma'am?
Maddie.
Maddie, far away, Maddie.
Sorry, last question, it'll be quick.
They're always the dangerous ones, they'll be quick, and it's a half hour.
A little, so kind of going off of what Mina was asking,
yes.
I think it's kind of easy to understand how God can use pain and suffering to change someone's life. But how is it that, I think the biggest thing that I personally struggle with is understanding why he uses innocent people. Specifically people that are, persecuted, like you said, in Egypt, for example. For us, we see cases of persecution all the time where kids and innocent women and children are being tortured and killed. Why is it specifically that he uses those cases instead of, for example, turning a bad situation for a terrorist until, granting him some sort of light to see him? Why does he use that?
Yes. Yeah, I agree that that's some of the, some of the toughest questions to answer, right? Egypt, of course, you say many, many examples. Look across the Muslim world. Many, many examples. The one that's been on the news a lot in recent weeks is Asia Bibi in Pakistan, the lady who has been in prison for 10 years, accused of blasphemy. Finally had a conviction overturned by the Supreme Court of Pakistan, but now, if she was set foot on the streets, would be torn apart by a baying mob. And you look at it and you think, oh, Lord, why? The first thing I guess I would say here is, of course, again, this is not a new question. If you read the Psalms, this is an old question. You can find David, and the psalmists asking these kind of questions. Lord, where are you? Why is there injustice? Why is this going on? So I think the Bible is very honest about the point that, sometimes it's tempting to look at the world and say, why doesn't God intervene here? Why doesn't God sort every situation out instantly? I think the next thing I'd say is we're very clear in our language that when we say that God can work through these situations, be careful not saying God causes them. I think that's an easy mistake to make, and I think Jesus warns us against that, of either sort of saying that God has done it directly or that it's the fault of the person. Jesus had that question to put to on numerous occasions. Why is this man born blind? Was it because of his sin or his parents' sin? And Jesus goes, no, actually it's neither of those things. So we want to be very careful about assigning divine agency. I think God allows some of these things to happen. I wish I knew all of the answers as to why. One answer, I suspect, comes back to that we do live in this broken, fallen world in which evil has caused the havoc that it has, and evil tends to pick on the innocent. It's not the strong who tend to end up suffering evil. It tends to be those who are the weaker in society, whether it's, as you say, the Christian community in a country where they're in the minority, or if it's the people without resources here in Canada. It's not the rich who sit shivering on the street corners. It's the poor and the weak. And there's one of the most pernicious things about evil is that it tends to target the weak and the vulnerable, because the very nature of the strong often have the ability to resist, which is why the Bible is so clear, often on critiquing the rich and the powerful. Again, you may think you're rich and you're powerful, but your time is limited. What I would say, I think, in regard to that is two things. I think, firstly, if I was somebody who is weak and on the receiving end of that, the question then becomes, do I have any kind of hope at all? Am I living in a world where I'm never going to see justice? Or even if I can't fully understand why it's happening to me right here, right now, do I have some kind of hope this will be put right? And what's interesting is the number of people I've spoken to in those situations who have an incredible joy even in the midst of their suffering, because they know there is that certainty and that confidence. That doesn't answer every question. I wish I could answer every question. I'm being honest in saying I can't around some of the specific whys, because unless I have direct revelation, I can't tell you. I just point to some pointers here. And then secondly, I think the other thing that I find incredibly sobering is that when we look at who Jesus identifies with, he identifies mainly with the poor and the trodden, the downtrodden and the weak. And it's those of us who are not in those kind of situations that I think are the ones who have to watch ourselves the most. And I just find that interesting, that having had friends who've been through those situations, having had the privilege of travelling a lot in the Middle East and spoken to Christians who have suffered some of the things that you describe, often that very real sense of that identification with Christ. And I've always come away very, very shaken up. I remember a Middle Eastern leader once saying to me, he said, big difference between the East and the West. He said, the biggest challenge facing us as Christians in the East is persecution. Biggest challenge facing you Christians in the West is seduction. He said, I'm glad I live in the East. I remember thinking, I never really thought about that. And we miss the fact where we are weak and oppressed, and because it's an easy oppression, we don't tend to look at it. So I can't answer every question as to why. I can tell you about the kind of world we live in, and I think why evil does the things it does. I can tell you God's view of this. I know for certain there is hope. I also know there's a responsibility for those of us in the West. But I think one of the challenges for us in the West is we don't stand up enough for our brothers and sisters in the East who are undergoing some of the things they are undergoing. I think there needs to be more said in Western churches about the suffering, persecuted church, because I think they hold a mirror up to ourselves. It's often uncomfortable, and Jesus said, that which you do for the least of these, you're doing for me. So I think there's a big question about our response to this. But as for the specifics of why it's just individual situations, I'm very honest, I can't tell you why. And we often can't answer the specifics. In the same way that I can't tell you why it's my friend Anthony who got mugged on the streets of London, and why it wasn't some stranger 3 doors away who I didn't care about. Why was it my friend? I don't know. I think I can tell you why I live in a world in which people get mugged and why people get persecuted. I think I know what God's done, and I think I know what our duty is as Christians. But there are gaps in there, or all I can do is pray and go, look, Lord, I know that you are, the judge of all the world, and we seem to do right, even if I can't always fully know what that is in this very situation. I hope some of that helps. I appreciate that may not be fully the answer you're necessarily looking for. We're going to take a break, I think, at this point, because coffee is kind of ready. We've got another session in a short while. So we're going to take, I think it's a half-hour break. Is that right? Someone who's yes, some of the powers that be at the back nodding yes. Okay, so we will start again at 10 to 4 for our final session. I just went to lift it. I got back down now. Right, all right. Oh, yes, yeah.
What's up? Good, how are you?
Oh, yes.
He started at 10,
It's interesting you say that and go, it's been your heart, so I can want to acquaintances. So one of the greatest missionaries is the Middle East right now is ISIS. Because it's we're very careful to get terrorists, not everybody was very careful to try. I don't know how we can describe it, but
Well, at the very least, I was right there. So it's not the elite, but it's nice. It absolutely is nice. It's right back to the very, very beginning.
How's your phone?